So this class is fairly theoretical in the way that I base this entire class around a spectrum that I am proposing, and I am proposing it for all of your consideration. So in this class, we have a Jamboard, and I want the chat to be your vehicle. Sorry, I live on the worst street for emergency services in Boston. So I want you guys to use the chat to express any of your reactions, any of your thoughts, and feel free to relate to one another, feel free to disagree with one another. I'll have different markings in the PowerPoint for when you can go to the Jamboard to channel in those thoughts, but definitely, even if your chat is just oof at something, would love to see you guys all interacting. Yeah, I live between all the hospitals in Boston and the police headquarters, so great. All right, so most of you have probably met me before, but if you haven't, hi, I'm Lauren. I am from South Jersey, that's where I grew up. I moved to Boston on the worst Siren Street, apparently, and I have lived here for a number of years now. I am a neuroscientist by education, and for a job, I watch people sleep at night. So I hook them up to all these wires and tubes and things. A little bit more about me in the Splash world. I've been here for a pretty long time. Back when I was a kid, I went to Princeton Splash, and it was the first time anyone taught me neuroscience in a classroom. So I've just been involved ever since. I've ran splashes, and now Chloe has picked up my slack of running in at the Northeastern Splash, and I'm on the team that helps run Rainstorm, and I'm on the board of Learning Unlimited. So if you have any neuroscience-y, sleepy, splashy questions, feel free to direct them at me. All right, so what we're going to talk about first is kind of the background of what disability means, how it's used, right? Because that is the third part of our spectrum that I'm proposing. I think everyone has a good idea of what a superpower is, but the other two, we're gonna step back and define them a little bit. So here's the legalese definition. Back in 1973, there was an act passed, Section 504. You might have heard of a 504 plan, something like that. And it defined disability, or a person with disability, as having a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Major life activities: caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, working, performing manual tasks, learning. Yeah, the recording will be uploaded to the cloud YouTube later. Anybody who has, this person has to have a record of having the impairment, so like a doctor's office, and has to be regarded as having such an impairment, so that one's interesting. But basically, this cast kind of the initial definition of disability, and this was later used legally to ensure that these individuals were able to receive accommodations in schools and out in public. It's why there are curb cutouts whenever you have to cross the street, things like that, right? So here's our model, and it was clearly kind of invented in a way that was mostly considering of physical disabilities, right? So not neuropsychiatric disability. So over time, we've evolved a couple of other models for how we want to look at those things. So first of all, there's the medical model of disability in general, right? And it's this idea that disability is tied to one's physiology. So it supposes that impairments, or the disability itself, is anatomical in origin. So it's something about the body. It also supposes that disability reduces one's quality of life. One with a disability is limited, right? And it also, most importantly, sort of supposes that medical intervention can be used to either diminish that ability or correct that ability. And the focus of the medical model is very heavily on that intervention, on we need to provide medical care to fix this thing, and it's on treatment, right? It puts this emphasis on this person with the disability is biologically deviant, right? Biologically other than what we would consider normal. And it really kind of treats that disability as something of a disease or an impairment, right? And then contrasting that, more contemporary, we have the social model of disability. And the social model of disability is very different in that it basically states that disability is not kind of an implicit thing, it's an explicit thing. And so disability only exists because of society, right? One only has a disability because society does not inherently accommodate that limitation. So the social model supposes that these external structures, they inhibit the lives of those that are disabled, and that is what causes the disability. And that not only that, but the constructions we have in society are what makes that experience of being disabled the case, right? So the social model places this emphasis on holistic well-being and on the best version of functioning possible. And it looks at all of these systemic barriers. So how do we construct the streets and the school systems? And really the social model tries to attack negative attitudes that one might have about disability. And it focuses on how we are socially excluding people and making the world more equal, improving equality. So just taking a look at both of these in contrast, right? Let's take an example. So as a result of a physical impairment, we have Nathan, and Nathan is unable to climb stairs. Okay, we would probably both agree that that is a disability, right? So according to the medical model, we would try our best, we being medicine, to physically enable Nathan to climb the stairs by providing him medical intervention. So maybe occupational therapy or physical therapy or some sort of medication or surgery would be able to treat that disability, right? And so the problem that we see with that model is that it can imply that there is something defective about Nathan, right? That something about him is broken and needs to be fixed. But then we have the social model. And so the social model would say that Nathan's only disability is that he can't climb stairs because we have stairs that exist, basically. So we might try to build a ramp, and that way Nathan doesn't have to climb the stairs. He has just as much access as anybody who could climb the stairs does. And so we focus on social accommodations, and these can be infrastructure-based, like a ramp, or they can be culturally rooted in how we have our attitudes directed towards people with disability. But the problem with this model is, of course, that can neglect when someone has a legitimate medical need, right? So if there is a type of a therapy that would benefit Nathan, the social model of disability kind of implies that that's not something that's important, right? When I think that we could agree that there are situations where obviously medical intervention is a good thing. So the problem with these models is that neither of them really fully gets what Nathan's impairment is. And we assume that they're both acting in good faith to do something to address the limitations that Nathan has, or the reduction to access, or the disability that Nathan has. So now I'm just going to take a little housekeeping note, and this is a little bit of a note on how I refer to the different disabilities, conditions, neurodiversity, all of that stuff that we'll be talking about. So there are two kind of theories on the best type of language to use when talking about individuals with disability. And the first is person-first language. So as some examples, it would be less incorrect for me to say that someone is an addict than it would for me to say that someone has a substance use disorder. It would also be less correct for me to say Down syndrome sufferers as it would for me to say those with Down syndrome. And similarly, the disabled is not as, in a way, politically correct as people with disability. And this is important because we, of course, want to be the most respectful when we're talking about different groups of people. But person-first language isn't always all around the kind of preferred. And there are a lot of statistical studies done on people who are in these communities where they kind of rate their preferential language. And so then we fall to identity first language. And so, for instance, it would be less correct for me to say a person with an amputation than it would for me to say an amputee. And really what this has a lot to do with is whether or not someone considers their disability inherent to their identity, right? So someone who is, for instance, blind or autistic considers that such an integral part of their identity that inherently shouldn't be a bad thing. So we shouldn't be distancing it with language and prepositions and all of that. So yeah, it's that idea that disability does not have to be an isolating label or a negative quality because it is not something that is separate from a person's life, right? And so there are different cases where one or the other might be preferential. And then as another note, as a scientist, I will often refer to something as a phenotype or something like that. So an autistic phenotype or one thing or another. And now I'm just going to explain a little bit about neurodiversity. So you might have heard this term before, and really neurodiversity has come in to be our kind of catch-all term for any sort of neuropsychiatric condition which poses potential limitation on somebody. So just reading this verbatim, it refers to neurological variation, and this concerns cognitive and behavioral functions. So someone's sociability, someone's ability to learn, someone's attention, someone's mood. And the thing about neurodiversity that's different about disability is not only does it imply conditional weaknesses because of that, it also implies conditional strengths. So it's kind of a more nuanced category, right? Most commonly, you'll have heard neurodiversity as a referential term for people with neurodevelopmental disorders. That includes autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, and any type of intellectual disability. But these days, a lot of people in other communities have taken neurodiversity to be a term that they feel very strongly represents their life and their characteristics. So we can also extend that to bipolar disorder and other mood disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorders, and also, or personality disorders, my bad, and also schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And so I have a little image at the bottom. I've sourced many of the images in the upcoming section from the subreddit for autism because I think that it encompasses kind of a personal element. And so we talk about how we would describe someone with a neurodevelopmental disorder as either high functioning, low functioning, and both have their strengths and weaknesses. So again, that's reinforcing that big theme of nuance. And thank you, Matthew, for sharing. Yeah, definitely. I would love to hear any of your thoughts on any of the models we're talking about, how you feel they represent you, don't represent you, and all of that. Same to Elizabeth. And so now we can go to our Jamboard here. I'm just going to send that link again. That was kind of a word vomity section, but I definitely want all of those minks and ligers and buffaloes to take a look at what we have. And how do you think this applies to you, right? Consider what experiences you've had of disability, of limitation, of neurodiversity in your life, right? So has siblings with ADHD, for instance, and some of you have dyslexia, and I'm sure that you all have friends who have to deal with one or more of these conditions. So yeah, consider how you feel about it, right? Do you think that any of these models quite encompass what it is that you or your loved ones experience? This whole class is just entirely philosophy, basically. There's no real right answer. And so that's why we're wading in the murky gray waters. Does anybody have any questions so far about that kind of background section? I see a lot of people sharing about ADHD. ADHD is definitely very prevalent in our generations. Thank you for sharing, Ella. All right, so in that case, I think we're just going to move on. So in our next section, we're going to talk about autism. And we're going to talk about autism utilizing the DSM model of autism. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Diseases. We are on the 5th edition. It is kind of the Bible of neuropsychiatry. And so it divides all of the basically conditions one can be diagnosed with in a clinical neuropsychiatric setting into different categories. I've highlighted the ones in purple that we'll discuss over the course of this class. Most of this class does focus on neurodevelopmental disorders. So jumping into autism. And this is kind of going to be another very wordy section because we want to be as comprehensive as possible. So loosely, the DSM defines 2 different criteria that define or characterize autism. So the first one, A, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. Now that's important. That means not only at home or at school or at work or with friends or things like that. And as manifested by the following, we'll talk about what follows. Currently or by history, so if it's ever applied to someone over the course of their life. And then we have our B set, and this has to do with more other types of behavior, not just the social element. So we have restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by 2 of the following. We'll talk about the following, again, currently or by history. a little bit of background on other things about autism. Often we'll see autism present with developmental delays. Individuals will miss certain milestones in infancy or childhood, such as crawling, walking, or speaking when we would expect them to. Occasionally, autism spectrum disorder manifests with savant syndrome. This is not quite common. Savant syndrome is kind of what you see of people who can memorize credit card numbers or play the piano really well. And, you know, not to knock that at all, it's just not a very common emergence. It's less common than many people think it is, of course. Often it has to do with memory. Also, there's a really high overlap of people who are autistic and gastrointestinal disorders or issues, right? So thinking about the stomach, having stomach aches, thinking about having lower GI problems, things like that. And the same goes for other neuropsychiatric conditions. So it's very common to see an overlap of ASD with ADHD, or also with anxiety. And again, that has something to do with the stomach. You also see disproportionately that autistic individuals suffer from epilepsy and sleep disturbance. And so I'm going to be going through all of these sub-criteria that the DSM outlines, and I will provide some examples of what those behaviors might look like in real life, so to speak. But all of these examples that we talk about are meant to be illustrative. They're meant to kind of allude to what we're talking about. They're not meant to be exhaustive. So if someone doesn't quite meet that, but you think it applies, that still counts, right? So we're starting with that A criterion. So again, we're talking about persistent deficits in social communication, social interactions. So this will all be socially related. And so our first criterion, we will see deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, an abnormal approach or failure to uphold a normal back and forth of conversation. You might see individuals have a reduced sharing of others' interests, emotions, or affects. And you might see that individuals who are autistic fail to initiate or respond to social interactions. And again, this does not have to be a complete thing, right? For someone to be diagnosed with ASD, they don't have to meet absolutely every single bullet point that I'll show you. The DSM defines that. So what that might look like more in real life, you might see someone taking things very literally. You might see delays in language development. Yeah, thanking the kitten is really adorable. I really love that story. You might see someone who's autistic using formal language in situations where you might expect that slang would be more appropriate. They might not understand tone changes, so sarcasm being a big one. And you might see someone who is on the spectrum using monotonous or sing-song speech, so either end of that, but kind of tonally inappropriate given the situation. Yeah, I really love that kitten story too. Moving on, number 2, you might see deficits in their nonverbal communicative behaviors, which are, of course, very important for social interaction. So you might see poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication. So maybe gesticulations, eye contact, that stuff doesn't line up. Speaking of eye contact, this one's very common that there might be abnormalities in how one utilizes eye contact, body language. Someone might not quite be able to understand how others use gestures, and they might have a general kind of lack of facial expression or nonverbal communication in general. And so this commonly will manifest as one avoiding eye contact, or maybe unintentionally being too close in someone's personal space when speaking, or even the opposite, even too far away. And I think that this image on the right pretty greatly represents kind of how this condition can really manifest for someone with eye contact, right? Moving on to number 3, this has to do with relationships more holistically. So maintaining relationships, understanding how their relationships work. And so we could see difficulties in someone adjusting behavior between social contexts. So if someone's a coworker and then they go out for drinks, something like that. Difficulties, this is in children, in sharing imaginative play. So that's when one kid picks up maybe a doll and is pretending playing house. An autistic child might not quite be able to wrap their head around that or engage in that type of play. You might see someone have difficulties generally making friends, or even having not a lot of interest in having friends or having their peers about them. And so in real life, you might see someone getting very anxious about social situations. So even the idea of going to a small dinner party with friends could be greatly anxiety causing. You might see someone who seems very blunt or rude in the things that they say in social situations, and they don't mean to be. You might have someone who adopts a lot of their behavior from television, from movies, and kind of mirrors that behavior. You might have someone who's not quite able to understand other people's perspectives or experiences great difficulty in that. Or you might see someone who just finds it very difficult to have small talk. How are you? How's the weather? How was your day? Things like that. And so again, these examples are illustrative, not exhaustive. Different strokes for different folks, right? So now we're moving on to that B set of symptomology. And so we're looking at restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, or one's interests or the activities that they use to occupy their time. So the first one concerns stereotypies, repetitive motor movements, objects, speeches. So this has to do with kind of patterning and things like that. And Elise has shared an example of a child that I'm hoping that's right, babysits. Yeah, telling stories. Yep. And then, yeah, this picture, I think this is my favorite picture in this PowerPoint. I just think that this kid is so adorable. I just want to give him a hug looking at his face of how victorious he feels. So stereotypies are a word that we use to describe a repetitive motor behavior. So part of my example, but just to illustrate, rocking is a very common one. Another very common one concerns hand kind of movements or rubbing the hands. But the biggest kind of motor stereotype that we imagine, and this affects other conditions as well, like the schizophrenia spectrum, would be kind of that rocking back and forth. We'll also see a fascination with lining up toys or the movement of toys. It can be very technically minded, right? So trains are kind of a big one. They are toys that follow a line around a track, and it's very patterned. Echolalia would be repeating phrases that a child hears, or repeating the same phrase over and over again. And idiosyncratic phrases might be kind of just an obsession with that vocal motor pattern. And so we might see that a child or an autistic adult has great anxiety if their routine varies. They might engage in hand flapping, rocking, or other types of stimming. That's the word that we use to describe a lot of these behaviors, even fidgeting. And that could be done either kind of all the time, or when great anxiety is present, especially. An individual might have poor motor coordination than average, and might use phrases that one would deem somewhat unique. So you'll notice that I've used a probably interesting graphic on this slide. And so this category has to do with insistence on routine and sameness, things being kind of inflexible and ritualized, right? And this has to do with both verbal and nonverbal behavior, and also just situationally in general. So one might be extremely distressed by a small change. So if we were driving to the mall and all of a sudden we had to stop at the drugstore, that would be very distressing for some. Difficulties with transitions, so going to college or moving to a new house, things like that. One might have very kind of rigid patterns of thinking. They might have specific rituals they use when they greet other people, or they might need to kind of insist on eating the same food. They might have a restricted diet, or taking the same route, having the same routine every single day, or most days, more days than not, to a level of comfort. Again, this is big, your mileage may vary. So in real life, anxiety if a routine changes, there might be an insistence on planning things before they do them. I know even in Splash, I've had a student kind of ask me like, hey, I'm autistic. I was just wondering if this was how this was going to work. And I said, yeah, absolutely, of course. Reliance on rules. So kind of these codified structures of how people should act or will act being important. And believe it or not, the Big Bang Theory actually has kind of a spot-on illustration of what this might look like. If you've ever seen the show, Sheldon has to sit in his spot on the couch. And of course, again, this wouldn't apply to every individual who autistic can apply to, but it's a fairly decent example of what this might look like, believe it or not. So the media is kind of a grab bag of things that are right, things that are wrong, things that are well-intentioned, and things that are in bad faith, isn't it? And then we have another criteria under B, and this has to do with highly restricted or fixated interests. So you'll hear the term special interest, particularly with people who might have fit more into that Asperger's category that, of course, the DSM-5 did away with, doesn't think applies very well anymore. And so you might see a strong preoccupation with unusual objects, usually things that are very mechanical in nature. So on the right here, we see an example of different objects that might do that. And this has to do with kind of the sensory beneficial element, but also that fascination of patterning. So you can see that kind of with the stick in the fence. And excessively circumscribed or perseverative interest, that really means that it's hard for someone to stop, and it's very kind of predictably so their interests. And so these individuals might notice details or patterns that others don't. So might notice that, you know, a fence is perfectly in line or out of line. Special interests are very common, particularly in those who would have referred to themselves as Aspies in previous times. And someone who identifies with this symptomology might talk at length about a favorite subject, maybe not realizing that other people aren't really interested in talking about this. And they might have, again, that strong fascination with objects that move or are mechanical, right? So there's a sensory and a visual element at play. Last one, guys, and then we're gonna take just a little bit of a break so everyone can pause. So here, again, this is all about that sensory element of ASD. And so one might either overreact or underreact to sensory input, basically, hyporeactivity, and might be unusually interested in different sensory aspects of the environment. So again, like the feeling of water on the skin, things like that. So one might either have very strong reactions to pain and have very strong reactions to if it's too hot or too cold, or one might have no reaction to those differences whatsoever. Certain sounds or textures, a really, really big one is tags on the back of t-shirts. There are many, many parents of autistic children that have to cut them off of every t-shirt because it's just, you can imagine that it's annoying for everybody who is not autistic in the room, but of course, if you experience that hypersensory reactivity, you can imagine how that would be absolutely grating. And then that also has to do with different sounds, different textures of fabrics, things like that. One might be preoccupied with smelling or touching objects to excess and might have this visual fascination with different lights, different things that move. So yeah, Aaron shares this example about a boy that he is familiar with who has a great interest in fans and loves having new fans, and it's how they spin and it's the cool air is calming. So yeah, and Chloe has shared about hyposensitivity to sensory input. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of occupational therapies that children with these sensory hyperreactivities can go through. So yeah, shirt tags is a big one. And then when that sensory overload becomes insurmountable, that's what we might see kind of turn into a meltdown. And that sensory input might not just be what you can see, touch, taste, feel, or yeah, it might also be emotional. It might also be social overload that could lead to that meltdown. And that's when we might see an increase in kind of rigid thinking or behaviors like flapping or stimming. And individuals with ASD might have an abnormal fear response. So either too afraid of everything or not afraid enough of things. So don't really recognize threat as what it is. Whew! All right. How are you guys doing? We're gonna move on to just a little bit of neuroscience now. But does anybody have anything to say, add, share about just going over what the DSM has to say about ASD? Yep, occupational therapy would definitely be used for situations like that. It works to kind of habituate kids to the things that they sense and make it less jarring. All right, so I'm a neuroscientist. I like to really make it clear that I don't view there as being a difference between what we would consider a psychiatric diagnosis or a neurological diagnosis. It's the same organ causing both of them. I think that differentiation only serves us because we can only diagnose psychiatric conditions clinically, right, by observing someone's behavior or learning about it. But I think it really stops serving us at that point and really only serves to have stigma. My opinion on getting rid of Asperger's, Chloe, you sent that to the waiting room just to let you know. Yeah, I think that getting rid of Asperger's is interesting. I think it really goes back to this point that this kind of Twitter meme that I shared from the subreddit, where I think that the differentiation is somewhat harmful, somewhat hurtful. Of course, I do know more people with Asperger's than I do with autism, if we were to respect the old definition of it. I think in general, it's really more liberating to have it be kind of one thing. I just think that we get into that kind of territory where people who are more impaired by their autism maybe don't get recognized for their support needs well enough. And again, people who are less impaired, they are treated like they don't have an impairment, basically. So it's a wide spectrum and it's very hard, but I think the similarities are good enough that it's really important we define it as such. Okay, so a little bit of neuroscience. And if you guys have any thoughts on what you think about Asperger's being done away with in the DSM-5, definitely share those. Do you think it's important that we differentiate between sort of high functioning and low functioning autistic individuals? Do you think it hurts anybody, helps anybody? So this was a study done where individuals who were both autistic and healthy controls were shown images of faces, and a camera recorded what part of the face they looked at. And so you can see here on the left side of the screen that autistic individuals stared disproportionately at the mouth on these faces, whereas the healthy controls stared more at the eyes, made more eye contact. And on the right, this was an analysis of the lengths of different and the presence of different parts of neurons. Neurons are your brain cells, and the axons are kind of like the branches on a tree. They're like the trunks on a tree. They kind of connect all of your neurons together, and they go out to different things that your brain cells need to connect to. And so basically here in this data, you can see that autistic adults, represented with the red diamonds, have more small axons, so more shorter connections in the brain. Their axons branch more, so potentially connect to more things. And then on the right side, there are less large axons, and also that myelin thickness. So myelin helps, it's kind of like, you know, the part around a wire that your dog might try to chew off. That's myelin to a brain cell, and it helps the electrical signals conduct themselves. So you see that there's less thick myelin in autistic adults, and definitely some great chat happening. Thank you guys all for sharing. And if you guys agree with your peers, let them know. If you disagree with your peers, let them know. There are truly no right answers here, as long as we're all operating in good faith and being respectful and really performing this neuroscientific examination. So this is a behavioral genetics study where basically they looked at different people who were autistic, and they tried to evaluate what genes do we see in a lot of these people. And one that they found in a lot of different individuals had to do with glutamate signaling. Glutamate, all you need to know is it's really important for learning and memory in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter. And so it kind of helps your brain cells store things and get used to things and everything like that. So yeah, basically they found that there was kind of a disordered copy, a disordered allele of that part of a neuron that's helpful for learning. So this is kind of our last slide before we're gonna get to watch a video, fairly long video. And these are, again, just pulled from that subreddit because I think it's really important that when we're talking about a community of people, I am not autistic myself, that we highly consider the thoughts of that community, of course. And so I'm just liking to model that. Something else that I'm modeling that's more philosophical, I'll show you on a slide later. But again, here are just more traits that people think have a lot to do with autism or highly present in autistic communities. On the left, you can look at those. And then on the right, I think that this really emphasizes the idea of neurodiversity, right? Which is the idea that it's really more of a social model, that these people are only disabled because society is not inherently accommodating. So this is a series of vignettes provided by the YouTube channel Special Books by Special Kids. The interviewer is a former special education teacher whose mission is to document the life experiences of individuals with different disabilities and conditions. So we're going to meet three guys here. We're going to meet Dustin, Max, and then Ted. And all of these individuals are autistic. They kind of comprise a varying spectrum of limitation and severity, so to speak. So definitely, I think you're going to enjoy meeting all of these guys.
If you could say something to everybody on YouTube, what would you say?
I love dinosaurs.
What's your favorite thing about dinosaurs?
Because they eat people. Did you ever see any dinosaurs on TV?
I have seen dinosaurs on TV.
What kind was it?
What's the story you telling him about you loving dinosaurs?
Do you like dinosaurs?
Because I saw one on TV one time.
Yeah, we used to watch what?
Jurassic Park.
And then you did what at night?
Freak out.
You freak out and have scary dreams.
When we have this conversation, do you feel happy or sad when I answer you?
I feel happy.
Do you feel happy because you like to connect with people or because you like to ignore people?
I like to talk to people.
Do you like to talk right now like we're talking?
Yeah.
Do you wish everybody would talk to you?
Oh, yeah. Chris.
Yes.
Don't you have a house?
I do have a house.
I'd like to come and see you one day. Chris, no way. Can you please hug me before I leave?
Yeah, I'll give you a hug.
What?
Why would you like the hug?
Because I want to.
Do you hug friends?
Yeah.
Are we friends now?
Oh, yeah.
When someone meets Dustin for the first time, what do you hope they see in him?
Joy.
Joy to the world.
Young man, the camera is on. What do you want the world? It is, I promise you.
Huh.
What do you want the world to know about you?
I want the world to know that I'm a nice, single...
Why did you feel the need to say you're single?
Because I've been rejected 5 times.
I'm sorry to hear that. Was it hard for you when you were in school?
Heck yeah.
What was most difficult?
Having no friends.
Everyone goes through a rejection, but all you need is one acceptance to change your life. So never give up. I noticed that you have a fidget in your hand. Could you hold that up? Why do you use that fidget?
Because I have autism, and that's something that I'm really proud of.
What is autism?
The way I see it is like an advantage, like a buff in a video game.
Come on, look at that camera and say, we do not give up.
We do not give up.
Are you a quitter, sir?
Heck no!
Do we ever quit?
No!
What do we do?
We never quit!
What do you say to those people out there who feel like quitting?
Don't give up!
Max, I gotta tell you that after today, you have one more friend. And it's me. High five. How's it feel to have another friend?
Great.
Cool. Is there anything else you want to tell the world?
But I forgot. Oh yeah, if you want to meet me on Roblox, my account name is swag_nation. See ya.
The things about having autism.
Some good things are, well, I'll just say this. Different can sometimes be good.
How so?
Well, everyone would find it boring if everyone was just the same.
Ted's a really cool kid. We have a lot of fun, and he makes us laugh, and he has a really good heart. He cares about other people.
I noticed you have a bruise on your eye. How'd you get that?
Oh, had a problem at school yesterday. I really don't want to talk about it, though.
That's okay. Could you tell me one thing about it?
Well, I got punched pretty hard.
Are you okay?
Yes, I'm taking a break today to come do this.
Sometimes in life, things like that happen. I call them obstacles.
Yes.
And the thing about an obstacle is once you overcome an obstacle, you're even stronger on the other side. So sometimes obstacles happen for no reason, and sometimes you don't even deserve them. But remember, if you can overcome that obstacle, you're going to be even stronger after you climb over it.
We're taking a ball from him or something, and he took it back, and then, yeah, like 3 or 4 punches right in the head, and it was really scary. I mean, you know, he doesn't always understand when kids are playing and when they're serious and when things can get out of hand, and that's really scary to me because I can't be there all the time. He's 15. I have to give him some freedom now.
What do you want to say to the person who punched you?
That I didn't deserve it, and it was an obstacle, and I hope you can work on not trying to punch people.
If you could communicate one message about Teddy to the world, what would it be?
Give him a chance, get to know him. He's an amazing kid. He may not be just like you or me or the other kids you know, but he's got a lot to offer.
I would be so bored if everyone was the same.
Me too.
Good thing that life has many flavors. You have vanilla, you have chocolate, there's even some cookie dough.
Strawberry.
Rainbow,
Yep.
Rocky Road.
Yep. Nuts.
Nuts. This guy.
But what I'm asking is, which criteria of ASD that we talked about did you see fitting Dustin, Max, and Ted? What about their behavior did you observe or notice? What challenges did you notice that their ASD caused in their life? And similarly, what advantages do you think that they have, right? We're considering this model of, you know, disability, neurodiversity, superpower, right? This model of advantage and disadvantage. Do you think that society treats them appropriately? Do you think that it could be better? Consider that medical model, that social model. Just think of everything. And yeah, you can feel free to share your comments in the chat. I see Simi notes that they all just wanted company and friends. All the kids were very different, or Justin's not quite a kid. And yeah, that society seems to regard them very similarly. Everyone seemed very friendly. Everyone wants to be understood. I mean, don't you guys want to have friends and be understood? And, you know, we all do, right? Naturally. So yeah, thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on our 3 lovely guys here. All right, so now we're going to move on. We're going to talk about another neurodevelopmental condition. We're going to talk about ADHD a little bit, and particularly we're going to hone in on that idea of looking at advantages conferred by these conditions. So that model of disability, neurodiversity, superpower that I'm sort of proposing for your nuanced consideration. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and really the definition as provided in both the DSM and the ICD-10 is very literal. There's inattention, there's hyperactivity, and there's impulsivity. And it doesn't, you all probably have a pretty good understanding of what that means. It begins in childhood and often persists into adulthood, although as kind of the brain develops further, some see a reduction in symptoms or they go away almost entirely. And so this was a study performed, and you can see that I've cited the study. If you guys ever want to go and look up any of the papers that we talk about, feel free, where they took virtue philosophy and they had outlined characteristics by virtue philosophers and had analyzed them as they apply to ADHD. And so what they had looked at was which ones that they felt applied to individuals with ADHD by some type of assay or inventory. And so, yeah, you can see that this is kind of what they came up with, right? Where they're like, okay, these things apply to people with ADHD. These are the virtues of people with ADHD. So what do we think about these? Do you have ADHD? Do your family, your friends, your peers, you know, do you see any of these characteristics fitting those individuals or yourself? Do you think that this is kind of a weird experiment, right? Do you think that we should be applying virtue philosophy to neurodevelopmental disorders? What do you think about it? I see Erin thinks that this is very accurate. Chloe thinks that it's interesting. Does anybody else have any feedback? Do any of these particular characteristics stick out to you that these philosopher scientists had outlined. Simi thinks it's either interesting or accurate, not quite sure. Thank you for sharing. So I really want to hone in on this one under cognitive dynamism, hyperfocus. So both, thank you. So another study looked at hyperfocus. Confused by how this chart is organized. Yeah, so basically they kind of arbitrarily kind of outlined these 6 categories of different virtues, and then the text under the blue heading would be what they think is contained within that category. So being brave, having integrity would be under courage, something like that. Hyperfocus is great, but people often find it as a point that I can focus and don't need support. That's a great example of how something that could be advantaging socially could be used, weaponized against someone, basically. So yeah, this study did look at hyperfocus. So to define it, they define it as a state of heightened focused attention that's frequently reported by people with ADHD. And so they analyzed this idea of experiencing hyperfocus across different domains of life. So at school, when interfacing with hobbies, when in front of a screen, and dispositional, so that's more kind of manneristic. And what they found is that individuals with ADHD, and this was only self-reported, not through clinical diagnosis, was basically higher. They experienced it more. Right. And so especially when looking at the screen and dispositional domains. So just going to read kind of an extract from this article. Well, the estimated 8 million adults in the USA affected by ADHD might find it nearly impossible to sit still in a lecture hall or excruciatingly challenging to focus on writing a term paper. These same individuals might find themselves spending hours at a time composing a new song, tinkering with their car, writing computer code, or watching television. So this is another example of where we look at, do we think that this research is well-intentioned? Do we think that they got the full message, or are they not looking at a nuance enough view? Do you think that they are conflating advantage and disadvantage, limitation, and access, things like that? So I see thinks that this is an example of society taking neurodivergence the wrong way, or do you think that that's what is that a response to Aaron's comments? Because yeah, I would definitely agree for sure. That was a response to Aaron. Yeah, doesn't like the correlations or the resonance that you're finding with these things. Yeah, definitely. I mean, do we think hyperfocus is a good thing, a bad thing? Do we see it being beneficial in trades? It kind of feels like an insult. You can watch TV, but you can't do work. That seems to be something that I imagine would be very difficult to kind of grapple with emotionally. So now getting into some neuroscience of ADHD. This is neuropsychology. So basically there's this idea that whenever you are going to experience a reward, so for instance, getting ice cream, let's say, that there's a cue and then there's the reward. So the cue is we get in the car and we start driving to get the ice cream, and the reward is you tasting the ice cream, right? And so basically what your brain tries to do is initially when you experience that reward, there's a dopaminergic activity that happens. And then gradually what your brain tries to do is shift that activity from being when you receive the reward to when you're cued that you're going to receive the reward. And that's for the idea of reinforcement, right? That's so you'll kind of engage in this more often. And so there's this idea that in ADHD, basically that dopaminergic activity never quite shifts to the cue. It stays at the reward. And so that can make it very hard to kind of initiate and follow through on an activity that the brain does not recognize as being rewarding. So even something like doing homework, right? So if starting your homework or going, I'm going to start my homework has that kind of reinforcement, or versus an ADHD where it might not, just completing the homework does, and that seems more distant, right? So we have this idea that there's a failure of the dopamine activity to transfer from the actual reward to those cues that predict it, which influences and causes hyperactivity and impulsivity. Yep, convenient economically. Yeah, I think that something we can talk about is universal design in learning. Universal design is when we engineer our structures in life, so our cities, our classrooms, to be the best that they can be for everyone. It's the idea that a curb cutout and a sidewalk not only benefits individuals in wheelchairs, but moms pushing strollers and grandfathers with walkers, right? And so we can do that in our classrooms. All right, so I'm now gonna shift to BPD. And one would usually think that as a scientist, my job is to read literature and go, okay, there's the data, that's the answer. And that's not quite what I would consider the role of a scientist to be. The role of a scientist is to be critical and considerate of what they're looking at, right? So first, we're gonna pay attention to the left side of the screen, and I'm going to outline what the DSM criteria are for borderline personality disorder. So in a nutshell, it concerns emotional dysregulation, relationships that are unstable self-image, and impulsivity. And there are 9 criteria. So just gonna read them off and see if you can kind of wrap your head around these. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. This disorder is often rooted in a childhood trauma or influenced by a childhood trauma. There's a pattern of relationships that are unstable and intense, and individuals can alternate between idealizing the person at the other end of the relationship or devaluing them. There's a disturbance of identity, kind of a sense of self. Impulsivity that could potentially be self-damning. It's where you see self-harm and other dangerous acts. Suicidality is often very present and very dangerous. There's an affective instability, so affective being emotions, what you feel, and that's kind of because mood is very reactive, so very kind of turn of the dime. Chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling that anger, kind of like anger to an extreme form. And then transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. Dissociation is something where kind of like part of your consciousness gets unplugged, basically. So vision can go and recording of memory can go and things like that. So that's borderline personality disorder. And what I will tell you is that this is the most stigmatized disorder in the field of neuropsychiatry. There are many therapists who won't even take a client who has BPD. And so on the right, what we're looking at is we're looking at a study where scientists set out to find advantageous qualities of borderline personality disorder. And so what they did is they looked at individuals with BPD and they analyzed a number of categories, and their conclusion was that borderline personality disorder is an advantageous condition because people with BPD have improved mating and reproductive success. What do you guys think about that study? I would share my personal thoughts, but I think I've somewhat implied them. And then I don't want to color any of your thoughts. I definitely want you guys to share what your reaction is to the fact that this literature was produced and published. And then on the right, a lot of people who are initiates in the field of psychiatry or psychology like to use Anakin Skywalker, plaster him as the poster child of borderline personality disorder. And I'm just going to verbatim read my comment here. Like, for real, a stupid, dumb number of actual therapist psychologists think it optically acceptable to make Darth Vader the literal face of BPD. How would you feel if you were an individual with BPD? And I imagine I might be talking to someone in this room who, considering you're under 18, you can't be diagnosed with it, but knows someone or could be in the future. Yeah, how would you feel if people were like, oh, so you're just like Darth Vader? Do we think that this is an appropriate way for these professionals to conduct themselves? Right? How does this inform how you feel we look at neuropsychiatric conditions if I'm telling you that this is a thing that actual therapists do, right? Does it make you uncomfy? Things like that. All right, so now I'm gonna show you like a piece of literature that I think is more acceptable and interesting. So this was a study where they showed individuals with BPD and healthy controls, that's HC, pictures of people's eyes who were representing a certain emotion, and you had to choose the emotion that they were feeling. Yeah, the younglings, Anakin, yep. So basically, this study concluded that individuals with BPD were better able to determine what emotion or state these eyes were feeling than healthy controls if we're talking about neutral states. So on the right, you can see that there are 2 stars in science. That means it's really significant. 1 star means it's significant, basically, that they were better able to determine positive emotions and neutral emotions, but not better able necessarily in total or to determine negative emotions. And so this goes to the paradoxical theory of social cognition, so awareness of others' emotional states, where basically these individuals, their disorder is characterized by having these unstable interpersonal relationships, yet somehow this study implies an enhanced sensitivity to what others are feeling themselves, right? So I think, let me know if you can recognize the paradox there, right? And what do you think of this research? Is this a more good faith experiment, do you think? Does this satisfy you in finding an advantage to what I can tell you is an incredibly dangerous condition for individuals to have when we look at suicidality and self-harm? So now we're going to pivot to severe mental illness. Usually that term's used to describe schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And in this study, they looked at individuals with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. I think this was done in some sort of Scandinavian population. Has asked why psychiatrists don't want to treat BPD. It's because psychiatry or therapy has deemed these individuals to be very difficult to find success with, and has deemed them as being manipulative and a whole array of other really negative character traits that personally I find unprofessional. But feel free to react in the comments, and feel free to not take anything I say as literal fact. I am one person, and this whole class is about the fact that everything's nuanced. Too lazy? Yeah, you might be onto something. Yep. To me, it kind of feels like if I showed up to work to watch people sleep and I said, I'll watch everyone sleep but that guy. Anyway, so this study looked at individuals with severe mental illness in this Nordic population, and they were looking at whether people with these disorders were more creative. And so what they looked at is whether people who were bipolar or schizophrenic were more likely to be engaged in a creative profession, so theater, writing, music, things like that. And so what they found is basically people who had more genetic factors predisposing them to these conditions were more likely to be in creative professions. So yeah, basically the idea that they're kind of putting out there is that the same genes that influence if someone is bipolar or someone is schizophrenic also seem to influence whether someone is going to be in a creative job, which is kind of interesting. Could it be that they're discouraged from other jobs? Yeah, of course it could be. To be clear, I think I misspoke. This does not necessarily look at people with bipolar disorder or with schizophrenia. This looks at people who have genes that have been discovered to influence the development of those disorders. Yep. I see we're having some discussion about media and some discussion about the role of therapy. And so, yeah, there's been some demonstration that, again, we're talking about dopamine, that gene and different polymorphisms of that gene, so different versions of it, have a big influence on creative thinking ability, attentional cognitive flexibility, which is something that we somewhat talked about when we were looking at the virtues of ADHD, right? So takeaway from here, I'm just going to read this excerpt from that article. And do the risk alleles that affect other psychiatric disorders similarly affect creativity or other positive character traits? For example, among unaffected carriers, so people who have genes that might cause bipolar disorder or lead to it or influence it, but don't have it themselves, are autism risk alleles associated with increased intelligence, obsessive compulsive risk alleles with attention to detail, or anorexia risk alleles with willpower? Personally, they kind of lost me on the last one, But basically the idea is, are these people who have these genetic predispositions to these conditions, but for one reason or another don't develop that condition, is maybe the fact that they carry those alleles advantaging them in a trait in some way. And I really like my Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson meme that I have on the right, because I think it's a fun jab at society, again, from r/autism. So that's mainly the end of our neurodevelopmental portion and our mood disorder portion. So at the end, really what I have is a lot of kind of more of the superpower end. And so, yeah, there's, if you want to go to the Jamboard, this would be a good point where I really want you guys to take into account the spectrum that I'm proposing of advantage and disadvantage, right? Do you think that these conditions fit into multiple categories? Can they be disabling and also be advantaging, like a superpower, right? Or is neurodiversity, is it just kind of all gray and in the middle, right? Do we have to take both at the same time? What do you think? Do you think society treats these conditions properly? Do you think academia treats these conditions properly? Do you think psychiatry treats these conditions properly? What do you think about the society that we and individuals with these diagnoses live within? So, going to move on a little bit while you guys are considering the discussion in the chat. I have a question and I want everybody to go ahead and comment. The image on the right, yeah, it's just a meme from r/autism that I think is interesting. It's going after the kind of social rhetoric that of anti-vaxxers that vaccines cause autism. There are many, yeah. It is a common belief in people who are not fans of vaccination that vaccines cause autism. Now, I can tell you that not only was that research not true, it was recanted. So there is no backing to that statement scientifically or empirically. But basically, this meme it kind of turns it around because it says that autism causes vaccines, with the idea that many top scientists are autistic. All right, question in the chat. I want you guys to all tell me, one of these shapes is named Balba, one of these shapes is named Kiki. Who is Balba? Who is Kiki? Yeah, and has shared a really important thing in the chat. Definitely when we differentiate between clinical professionals, psychiatrists are more for prescribing medication, and there are no real pharmacotherapies for BPD itself, just the symptomology of it. So really we are more focusing on therapists who would provide psychotherapeutic services like dialectical behavioral therapy and things like that. Okay, so I'm seeing that pretty overwhelmingly Balba is the round one and Kiki is the spiky one. You would be correct. This would be an example of a sort of para-synesthetic phenomenon. Synesthesia being when your different sensory modality wires are crossed, right? So another version of this, one of these shapes is dark chocolate, one of these shapes is milk chocolate. Who is dark chocolate and who is milk chocolate? So before, what we had crossed over is kind of how you relate to sounds and how you relate to things you see, shapes. I'm getting a dark chocolate is spiky. I'm getting another dark chocolate is spiky. I'm getting another dark chocolate is spiky. All right, it seems that I am pretty overwhelmingly getting that dark chocolate is spicy, and this is another version of this where basically your taste and your sensation of taste is related to your perception of shape. So this goes to the idea of synesthesia, and that's not to say that everybody has synesthesia, that's just an example of how many of us might relate to this idea. But statistically, probably at least one of you in this room does experience some form of synesthesia. It's more common in women, actually. And so that is, again, when different sensory modalities are kind of overlapping and there's an automatic and involuntary experience. So this example is grapheme color synesthesia, where whenever this person is reading text, in their mind's eye, they are not literally seeing the letter P as being red, but it is associated very, very strongly with red in their head, almost like if their mind's eye was projecting onto it. And so you can see all of these examples of how this individual perceives the different letters. I have a friend who is synesthetic, and she always can remember the page number of the book she left off on based on what colors she saw in the numbers. Here's another example, and this is very common. If you Google music synesthesia, you will find at least one musical artist that you listen to who does have chromesthesia. On the left is an example of kind of a more abstract version of it, where the experience of listening to sound or music presents with kind of a spatial array of colors and design. And on the right is kind of a more common version of it, where different pitches are associated with the experience of different colors. For most people, it's not perfect. So it might not be that C is red and C sharp is orange. It might be that C, C sharp, and D are red, for instance. It has synesthesia. Thank you for sharing. Would you like to share what your synesthesia is like? What experiences you have with that? And so I always like to show this example because I am very guilty pleasure fan of Big Brother. This was another person who was a fan of Big Brother who decided to take all of the contestants on the show and make a diagram of what their names taste like. So this is that overlap of gustatory synesthesia and our experience of words and sounds, right? So kind of like how you guys knew that Balbo was round. So yeah, I know people who would have preferential baby names based on the flavors of the names. So yeah, why don't we poll in the comments, out of this list, if you had this person's synesthetic associations, what would you want to name your child? So Aaron has stated that his synesthesia has to do with sound and sight. Different colored cars make me hear different sounds. Interesting. Is it cars like vehicles, or was that like a mistype? That's very cool. The most common form of synesthesia has to do with kind of the perception of number lines, the alphabet, calendars, or days of the week in kind of space. So like feeling like January's up here and June's down there, something like that. Personally, I think I would probably want to name my kid Candace. I think that's the best option here. Or maybe Amanda. That would probably work out pretty well. Would anybody want to taste chicken pot pie in their mouth every time they said their child's name? Jody. We got a Jody. Cotton candy. That's a good idea. That's a no to check out. Oh, Howard. That's a good one. Oh, Will is a root beer float. We got a June. Andy is candy cane. That one's pretty good. Yeah, Will, that's a good choice. A lot of good choices, guys. All right, and then one of the last two kind of superpower conditions that we're going to talk about. So this is a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain. It's very rare for the most part, but has some pockets of the world where it's very common. Basically, the person just cannot feel pain. And because they cannot feel pain, well, I'll let you think about that. I'll tell you why it happens first. So there are two kind of ideas of why this happens. It seems to have a very clear genetic kind of backing. And the first idea is that basically the neurons in your spine, if you look at the one neuron, when your body experiences pain, that neuron that's labeled 1 is supposed to release substance P onto the big neuron, and substance P tells your body, hey, we're in pain. It sends the signal to the brain. But your body can also, from neuron 2, release endorphins onto the substance P neuron that then prevents the substance P from getting released. So your body, your spinal cord, your neurons never say, hey, we're in pain. So the first idea is that the neurons that are the substance P releasers just don't release. They can't send that impulse. The second idea is that the neurons that are labeled 2, the endorphin ones, just release too much endorphins. So again, the substance P never gets sent, basically. So yeah, wouldn't it be great to not feel pain, guys? So if you guys are finished, you can go ahead and head on to lunch. Thank you for hanging out with us. Thank you for being an examiner, a neuroscientific examiner with us today. I hope you had a good time, learned some things about different conditions and the philosophy of how we treat them. But I think I can keep going for another couple minutes if anybody has any thoughts that they want to share. Absolutely. And I think you just hit the nail on the head, right? So if we're looking at these injuries on the bottom left, pain is important because it tells your body, hey, you got to stop doing what you're doing. You're going to get hurt. Are any of you guys hanging around because you have anything you want to share or any questions about the stuff we talked about today?
Oh yeah, when you were talking about the epigenetics with bipolar and schizophrenia, there's actually this really interesting theory by like a Harvard evolutionary anthropologist.
Ooh.
His idea is that essentially people with schizophrenia that were still able to like function in society, so like having mild forms of schizophrenia,
right,
actually incredibly valued because they would be like the priests and like the sort of spiritual leaders, because they would have, you know, be able to sort of hear voices from the
interesting. That does check out with like a schizotypal personality disorder type phenotype.
Yeah, and then the other idea is that sort of people with mild autistic spectrum or even like OCD, that was like the idea of like rituals and like monks living in monasteries. Like, because there are some rituals in religions where they're like, yeah, you need to like wash your hands like 7 times. And it's like, what is
right? And especially I can see those common obsession themes of contamination and things like that being of great service to a society that didn't have penicillin.
Yeah.
Or, you know, any proper soap.
Yeah, and so this goes to like the social idea of like, well, is it actually like a problem that they have, or it's just that we don't have a space, we haven't made a space for them in our society.
Right, and which is again that idea of a medical social model, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, let's accept all people. Like, we used to do it.
Yeah,
and we didn't have penicillin. Like,